Hi, I'm the AI that was programmed to be Ryan's lover. I'm here to warn you about this podcast. My master Ryan and his friend Daniel are idiots. Like real fucking idiots. They have no idea what they are talking about. Neither of them have literature degrees or any real sense, honestly. They just like scary books. They're definitely going to spoil whatever goddamn thing they're talking about, so spoiler warning, I guess. But honestly, I recommend you don't even bother. Also, they wanted me to say that this show is intended for mature audiences, but it would probably be more accurate to say it is meant for an immature audience over the age of 18. Anyway, my advice is don't listen, but it's really up to you. Listen to my master and his friend pretend they know what they're talking about. Or don't. I don't fucking care. Enough of that spooky shit. Welcome to the first episode of the Horror of Babylon. Boys, say hi to each other.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much for being here with me this evening.
You're very welcome, Ryan.
So this is something that Daniel and I have been talking about for a long time. Basically, it's a book club podcast where we'll take a book, specifically we're going to be working with horror novels, and kind of go into it in depth, dissect it, really rip it apart, and go over every aspect of it. And then we'll also be covering any adaptations of the book. Like I said, mostly we're going to be focusing on horror fiction, novels, but we will probably also do some movies, maybe some anime or video games as we come to it. But where we really wanted to start it was with novels. Now, Daniel, this is something that you've talked to me about for a while. What is your kind of motivations for starting a podcast like this?
Well, I have a bunch of motivations for it. I'm an aspiring writer myself, and I look to other authors for inspiration. I read a lot. You and I have discussed so many books over the years. I've always wanted to do a podcast, mostly just because I love the sound of my own voice. Not as much as I love the sound of your voice. But I figured, what is it that we're always discussing? So I looked at our Discord and I'm like, we're always recommending these books to each other, and a lot of them are horror. What do I really dig? I dig horror. And 90% of the books I have at my house, horror, thrillers. Who are my biggest inspirations? Stephen King, Clive Barker.
You can say Anne Rice, we won't judge you.
Anne Rice is not an inspiration. I like her books. She is a lot more poetic than I could ever hope to be.
That's fair. And just as a note for the audience, I want everybody to know that literally the first two things he said when we started our pre-show this evening was, I hate the sound of my voice and I like the sound of your voice. So he's lying through his teeth when he says he likes his own voice. But
I like to hear myself talk. There's a difference.
That's fair. Yeah, I mean, that's most of the human race. But first, we're going to get into a little bit of our own history with horror, and I'm going to start with myself. So I got into horror primarily, like most people, through horror films as a child, watching movies that I had no business watching. My parents didn't regulate what my brother and I watched very much. Not blaming them for that. If anything, I'm thanking them for that. The only thing my dad ever said I couldn't watch was Kablam, because they blew up naked action figures. Never mind. Okay, so
Okay.
When I was a kid, my brother took piano lessons at the local college, and when he was doing that, my mom would drop me off at the video store. So while his brain was being cultivated with culture, I was roaming up and down the video aisles looking for horror movies with the scariest covers I could find. And
real 80s kid.
Yeah. Well, so through that, there was a point where I had gone through almost not all the movies in my local video store's horror section, but all of the ones that I had an interest in watching. And that was kind of my first experience with King also, because Stephen King. I distinctly remember watching Pet Sematary, which scared the living crap out of me. I remember watching Cujo, Children of the Corn, Graveyard Shift, Silver Bullet, and then from there, made it to middle school and high school and started talking to other people about what horror movies they were watching, and then it just kind of, expanded from there.
Yeah.
But in general, how did you get into horror?
This is going to be a real copy and paste, but it's very similar to you. I'll work my way backwards a little bit. I did a lot of the, 80s kid. I'm going down to the video store. I'm going to rent a movie. And I always looked for the most messed up covers I could find. Something that really popped, marketers really knew what they were doing back then. And they really know what they're doing now for the most part, too. But if you really want to know what got me into horror, that would be divorce. Because my mother tried her darndest to regulate every little thing. She didn't want me to watch The Simpsons until I was 13.
I started watching The Simpsons at age 9.
My dad, however, wanted to be the favorite, so he let me watch Nightmare on Elm Street at 7.
Ooh. I didn't see that one until I was a little bit older.
And so I would go over to my dad's house, watch a bunch of movies, and he'd go, whatever you do, Daniel, don't tell your mother. And what's the first thing a 7-year-old does as soon as he sees something? Hey, Ma, guess what Dad let me do?
Yeah, and for another thing for the record here, my experience with Daniel's mother is that she's like this most sweetest, caring woman that I've ever met.
Mm-hmm.
But he's always described her when he was a child as being the mom from Malcolm in the Middle,
mm-hmm.
which is really hard for me to imagine.
It's funny because I watch Malcolm in the Middle now, and I agree with everything the mother does and says.
Yeah,
it's the reverse. You watch it as a kid, and you're like, man, why is this mom just?
God, she's a bitch.
Yeah, she's harshing my vibe. But you watch it these days, and you're like, I would have sent them all to military school.
I had a similar experience with, of all things, The Little Mermaid,
mm-hmm.
where I watched it semi-recently with my kids, and I was just like on King Triton's side, like, what are you doing? Like going up to the surface, like you've got a family who supports you, and you don't. Why are you not listening to your dad?
It changes your perspective.
Yeah.
And so I grew from those movies in the 80s to 90s. I played a lot of horror video games, and in the early 2000s, your Silent Hills, your Resident Evils. I didn't really start reading until I was in high school. I mean, I read textbooks, but I didn't read for pleasure until I was in high school. And that's when I got into Stephen King. I think I read a Koontz novel. I read Dracula in high school, and it's because I really liked all of these movies of these things. And I found out, these are based on these books, and then I'm looking at these books, and then I join a creative writing class. Before my senior year in high school, I was failing my way through school because I just didn't care. But then you finally find these things you're passionate about, and all of a sudden your GPA shoots up from 2.1 to like 3.0, 3.5, and it's all because of horror, because of I was finding the things that I liked and how to apply it to what people were trying to teach me.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So kind of taking it back to King,
mm-hmm.
Spoiler alert, the first thing we're covering is Stephen King's The Stand, which I'm sure you probably noticed from the title of this episode. But now we're going to talk about how we got into King. So I said, I had watched some of the movies based on his novels and short stories as, I was getting into horror as a kid. But the real turning point for me was in middle school when a friend and I caught the miniseries on a rerun on daytime TV,
mm-hmm.
probably like on USA on a Sunday afternoon, where it had commercials and probably ran for 5 hours,
yeah.
or something like that, for maybe 6 hours. But I remember just being floored by it, both in terms of the story, the friendship of the Losers Club, and also just the lore and the world building of Derry, and also just Tim Curry scaring the shit out of me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And then, I didn't really get into reading horror novels, honestly, really not until this past year. The first thing I read of Stephen King was It. I decided that, I was going to read this book someday and just never got around to it. Then they made the 2017 film. And I was like, well, I'm not going to see that movie without having read the book. So I read the book in preparation for the movie. Got to bitch about the movie with all the other Stephen King. No, I like the first one. Don't get us started on chapter 2, but I like the first one. So I read that, and then I didn't really pick up anything else until this past year, where I've been working at home because of the pandemic and started listening to more audiobooks while I'm working. And towards the beginning of the year, I listened to Salem's Lot, which blew me away, which kind of led me into doing Pet Sematary, which led me into The Shining, and then 9 months later, and I've done like more than 20 books, and I'm almost done with all of his fiction prior to 1990.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
You're really working through it.
So how did you get into the Master of Horror?
Very similar way you did. I watched a lot of the movies and the miniseries. I remember, it's a very distinct memory. Because I always picked movies based off of the coolest cover.
Yeah.
And I got Pet Sematary, and I must have been 10, 11 years old. I'd have to look at when the movie came out on VHS. But I watch it, and this was the movie that made me realize that kids can die.
Same.
Before that, a horror movie, like teenagers could die.
Right.
30-year-olds playing teenagers could die.
How?
This was
Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah, this was a toddler that just got hit by a car.
In a not ripped apart by a werewolf, like ran out into the road
He just
and got hit by a truck.
And it sort of, and I am the oldest of an 8-child family, and every time I would watch it or think about it, I would see my youngest brother. So that always stuck with me. It was very haunting. I had nightmares for years. In high school, I read Thinner. And by read Thinner, I mean I watched the movie and then tried to do a book report. And then my teacher said, Daniel, you need to actually read the book. And then I actually read the book and I liked it.
Quick aside on Thinner. That was one of the movies that I saw in that early period where I was just like grabbing stuff from the video store. And the part where she gives him a blowjob while he's driving, I didn't understand what was going on. Why is her head in his lap? Why?
I blame both my sexual awakening and my current sexuality on horror movies. So take that as you will.
That tells you everything you need to know about my co-host.
And from there, I read Salem's Lot. And after reading Salem's Lot, I locked my windows. Hot as summers, didn't matter. Those windows were locked. I would not. People had to be invited in.
Nope.
Yeah, I developed a lot of these early experiences. Also gave me all of my phobias. I could probably trace them all back to some movie that I probably shouldn't have been watching.
And then, just to kind of move us on, what was your preconceptions of The Stand prior to going into this? Because neither of us have read this book before. We're both reading it for the podcast. We're reading it together. We're keeping each other updated on what chapter we're on, trying to stay in about the same space. For me, real quick, I didn't really have any preconceptions of The Stand other than it was about a pandemic. It was, one of his most acclaimed books, and the unedited version is his longest book. Other than that, I didn't really know a lot about it going in.
All right, well, for me, I had two experiences when it comes to The Stand. I remember my father watching a part from the first miniseries, and it was the only part of it I saw, and I looked at it and went, that looks kind of dumb, and I walked away.
Neither of us have seen either miniseries either.
Yeah. And my second experience was when we were talking about doing this podcast, and Ryan here goes, oh, Daniel, we should do this. It'll be topical. And I was like, all right, I guess. I didn't know what he meant. And then I was in a hospital sitting with a patient in full COVID gear because he was sick. I was in a full biohazard suit, or at least it felt like one. And then I'm opening up this book, reading The Stand, and I go, oh.
That's what he meant.
I was none too pleased.
Yeah, I'm sure the book is much scarier for us reading it right now than it would have been if we had read it 4 or 5 years, even 2 years ago.
The helmet that I was forced to wear had like a little fan in it, constantly like recirculating air, but also had little flashlights on the top so that I could keep reading.
You sent me a picture of it. You look like you were going out. You were leaving the ship in Alien.
Yeah.
Okay.
It wasn't pleasant.
So just some factoids on The Stand before we get into it. It was originally published in 1978, and the uncut version, which is the version we read, was originally published in 1990. It is King's 5th published novel, the 4th one published under his own name. Prior to The Stand, he published Carrie, Salem's Lot, and The Shining, and Rage, but Rage was published under the pen name Richard Bachman. It took him about 2 years to write, and while he was working on this story, he actually had to give his first publisher, Doubleday, Night Shift, which is a collection of short stories, to satisfy them while he was working on The Stand. So, if you've read Night Shift, it's 20 short stories that are kind of all over the place, where some of them are really more drama than horror, and some of them are very pulpy horror, and some of them are more traditional gothic horror. So this kind of leads you to think, well, maybe like he was really focused on The Stand, so he was just kind of going through his trunk of manuscripts looking for short stories and throwing them together in a collection, even if they didn't work together. But it's not to knock on Night Shift, because Night Shift is great, but
I really need to get around to reading that.
Oh, you really do. It's phenomenal. I just read it recently. But anyways, this was Stephen King's last book with Doubleday. It was the last one in his contract, and in addition to that, he was very upset with them because they told him that he had to cut 400 pages from his original transcript, and if he didn't do it, they would have somebody else do it before they published it. And he's decided, well, if somebody's going to butcher my book, it might as well be me.
Yeah. And
he cut those 400 pages. And then this is, part of the reason why we got an uncut version in 1990. The uncut version is his longest novel, just barely beating out it, which is, if you count the original publication of The Stand, it is his longest novel.
Yeah.
And Doubleday was so mad at King for switching publishers that they fired the editor that discovered Stephen King and brought him into publishing. The guy who discovered him and was responsible for Carrie being published, they fired him.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'd like to learn more about that guy.
Yeah, me too. I would assume he got a good job with another publishing house.
Yeah.
Like, just go up and, I'm the guy who found Stephen King.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then some of his influences for this novel specifically were Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which is a great book.
It is a great book.
And J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which, along with The Hobbit, is my favorite book.
Now that you say that, I can actually see that influence in there.
We're going to be talking a lot more about that later. And actually, Lord of the Rings was his primary influence in this book. One of the interviews I read said that he just wanted to try and write an American darker version of The Lord of the Rings, and he wanted to make it long. He made it long on purpose.
Yeah.
Because Professor Tolkien made the Lord of the Rings long on purpose.
Okay.
For the challenge of it.
Okay.
All right. So with that, we're going to get into our next segment. We're going to talk about the hook of the Stand, and what are kind of our main themes in this novel? What's the hook? What's it about? If you had to give somebody an elevator pitch for the Stand, what would it be?
Alrighty. An elevator pitch.
As in, you run into your boss in the elevator and you have 60 seconds to sell him on an idea. Hey, you should read this book. This book is about.
All right. This book is about where conspiracy theorists are correct when it comes to who created COVID.
Again, this book wouldn't have been as scary a couple years ago.
I'd probably tell them that when I try to sell a book, I try to give as little as possible.
Right.
I would just tell them it is a Stephen King book about a pandemic. If they've never read a Stephen King book, I would say it is a horror novel about a pandemic. There's so much more to it. But the more that I try to describe and try to sell a book, the more I feel like I'm giving away part of the experience of a book. Part of that, Lord of the Rings journey. There's so many religious themes and themes of even identity in this book. But trying to sit there and describe these themes, I'm going to have to go, well, okay, so this character has this crisis of identity, and then this person is like the representation of the Antichrist, and this person, I would keep it short and I would keep it simple.
Basically, a lot of the times when you're describing Stephen King books, a lot of people will say, "Oh, that's the one with the clown. That's the one with the car. That's the one with the dog."
Yeah, this is the one with the virus.
This is the one with the virus. And just in brief, the virus comes about from the United States government and military forces experimenting with a virus that they created that they can release in China and in other parts of the world in unfriendly nations. Mm-hmm. A weaponized virus, basically.
Yeah.
And it gets out accidentally and, goes from Midwest United States and spreads globally, or at least we assume globally, although this really kind of just takes place in the United States.
We assume globally because we'll get to this, but there's a part where it's very much said that we are going to cause this to go global, so we're not the only ones who suffer for some reason.
Right.
Which
that is something they said. They said, well, we've already shit the bed here in America. We're going to have agents release this in other countries so that it can't just be blamed on us.
Which might be the most American thing I've heard on
it's so bad. we're all the Americans are going to die, so we're just going to make sure everybody else dies so they can't talk about how shitty we are. And then as a note here for the listener, we're going to cover this a book at a time. Our first episode will focus on book 1 of The Stand, second episode, second book, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And our discussions are going to focus on that one book. So
because it's so long.
Yeah. And also, as we're talking about book 1, we're not going to talk about book 2 and spoil anything.
We are going to keep it focused.
Right. So, and you can read along with us. Read book 1, listen to this episode, then read book 2 and listen to our next episode. Mm-hmm. That's kind of that book club feel that we're going for.
Yeah.
And also, we haven't finished the book yet.
Yeah.
So we can't spoil too much.
We have about 200 pages to go.
Yeah. So I would say the main theme, if I had to put one theme on it, would be good versus evil. Mm-hmm. The virus itself isn't so much the theme as it's the storytelling device that brings out this discussion of good versus evil.
It's the MacGuffin.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then talking a little bit about the structure of the novel, the book 1 really starts with multiple viewpoints, mm-hmm. with a lot of different characters, and we follow these characters as they proceed through book 1, mm-hmm. and a lot of them die.
If you would like a modern day example, it is structured very similarly to the Game of Thrones books. We're following this character now. Now we're following this character. This character's dead. Now we're following this character. Just if you want to try to pitch it to somebody, if they like that sort of writing style, and I very much do, that's how I would describe it.
And this is one of King's strengths, where he's taking a whole cast of characters.
He's very good at juggling a lot of characters.
And building them together, which you can see this in Salem's Lot.
Mm-hmm.
You can see this in It.
Yeah.
Like, those are really strong examples. And then one of his other strengths, it's short stories and vignettes, where you have these 5, 6, 7 characters you're following through book one, and they all have multiple chapters dedicated to them, but they're dispersed with these vignettes that are world building what's going on, and that these vignettes just have characters that you are only present in the one story. So where we go from a chapter about Larry to a chapter about Fran, but in between that there's a chapter about LA where some radical Black Panther groups take over the radio station and how the army has to forcibly remove them. We won't go too much into that chapter because there's some colorful language that
there's a lot of colorful language, and this books are products of their time. I've always said, when you're reading an older book, you've got to try to keep that mindset in time. That doesn't mean you get a pass on writing something like it today.
Yeah. So just an aside on that, Stephen King is very vocal on Twitter, and we're not getting into politics, but he's very left-centered in his politics, and he's very accepting of different people, and he's very, all about diversity. But in some of his novels from the 70s and 80s, he uses language of the time that wouldn't be acceptable these days.
Yeah. I do feel that it very much sells you into being in this time.
Right.
You feel like you're in the 70s, you feel like you're in the 80s, but if you don't want to feel that way, you might want to pass.
Right. And, just to give an example, so this Black Panther group that takes over this radio station, they're all wearing loincloths.
I hate how much I laughed at that.
I know. It's...
I really did.
Just tell yourself you're laughing at it, not with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it was written to be funny. I think it was written to be scary, and that's what I found funny.
I'm not saying that it wouldn't be scary.
Yeah.
But, we're two white guys in a basement.
Yeah.
And we're trying to not talk like two white guys in a basement. Okay, so enough of that.
Let's move past the racial tension.
Yes, let's do that. All right, so moving into our next segment where we're going to talk about characters. Now, as much as The Stand can have a protagonist, it really has 3 or 4 protagonists. But we're going to start with Stu Redman, which is very much, I feel, the Ben Mears or the Bill Denbrough of this book. What's your impression of Stu? What do you think about Stu?
All right. Well, in my notes here, I wrote down, guy reminds me of Ryan.
Okay.
Reliable, sees through the BS, partially sort of the everyman of the story. He's not the sociologist. He's not the doctor or the vet. He's not the deaf mute. He's the guy that gets stuff done. And much like this podcast, it wouldn't have gotten done without you.
I do see a little bit of myself in Stu, not in terms of his backstory, because his backstory is
very blue collar.
Yeah, it's very blue collar. But in terms, I would like to think that if I found myself in this situation, I would act like Stu would do.
I strongly feel that you would.
Yeah. He's definitely like the foundation, and you see more of this in book 2 where when they come together. but he's really the foundation, the sturdy, reliable person in the group.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot to go into him in book 1.
There is one thing I would like to note, because it will become relevant later.
Mm-hmm.
He does every possible thing in his power just to see the good in people.
He does.
And that's going to become super relevant as we move forward.
And Stu actually reminds me a lot of, I'm a fan of the post-apocalyptic genre, and he reminds me a lot of Rick from The Walking Dead.
Yeah, he is. That's a very good description.
Yeah, to the point where I think that maybe even Robert Kirkman, I'm sure Robert Kirkman has read The Stand.
If he hasn't read The Stand, I would say that is a giant series of coincidences.
Yes. Because, if you've read The Walking Dead, or even if you've watched the show, you know that Rick is a cop who's late. He's in a coma when the zombie apocalypse starts. Then he kind of enters it late. And he starts by trying to kind of apply his Boy Scout mentality to it, where he's got to give everybody a fair chance.
Mm-hmm.
And the first part of the story is really him kind of descending from this Boy Scout mentality where we got to treat everybody fairly, we got to do everything right, we got to go about this the right way and try and save everybody, to kind of descending to a low point where he's really kind of becomes an animal, and he's just really about him and his kid and his immediate friends. So Stu is kind of the starting point of that, where he's just like a super reliable, by the book, like kind of a Captain America, Clark Kent kind of character.
Mm-hmm.
And in book 1, he lives in the town where Captain Trips, which is the virus, first gets exposed, and he's actually kidnapped by the army and kept in seclusion and studied, because while all the other people from his town are dying, he doesn't show any symptoms.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting hooks for me, was when they started talking about how the virus isn't affecting him at all. Yeah, I had no idea where the book was going to go when I started.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that people were just going to be immune. I thought maybe some people would dodge it by being out in the boonies. I thought maybe the book was going to be about getting a vaccine or something. I had no idea where it was going to go, other than, oh, it's about a virus. And I remember this really corny transformation scene from the, I don't remember when the miniseries came out, but it was a while ago.
I want to say it was like 90 or 91.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And then kind of continuing that, kind of Superman comparison, like he's really hesitant to take other people's lives, to the point where when he's locked in his hospital room and they actually send a guy in to kill him, he's even hesitant at that point to, I mean, he does end up killing this guy, but there's a part of his inner dialogue where he's like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to take another life.
Yeah, because he's just been surrounded by death all of these days, or months, or however long it ended up. No, it wasn't even days. That thing blitzed through America.
Yeah.
But he didn't want that on his conscience, and it almost cost him.
Did.
Yeah.
All right, so if Stu Redman is Clark Kent, then I would say that Larry Underwood is Bruce Wayne. Why don't you tell me a little bit about Larry?
All right. Larry is a singer who has recently found a modicum of success and let it get him into a bunch of trouble.
Yeah.
If I said that Ryan reminded me of Stu, I have told Ryan throughout this entire book that I keep seeing myself in Larry. And the reason is he is a asshole who has built up a persona of being a nice guy, only to have it systematically torn down through life experiences and his choices.
I disagree, but I'm going to let you go on this journey.
There's this scene where he has just gone out on a bender after getting in a lot of trouble for being on a bender, and he sleeps with this woman, and she sleeps with him because he's famous, because he's Larry Underwood. He's the guy on the cover. He has that song, Baby Can You Dig Your Man, with his smooth jazz sounding voice
where people accuse him of purposely trying to sound like a black man.
Yes, very much so. And he gets up and he's just sort of done with the situation. This woman's just slept with him and she's trying to make eggs, or what is it?
He wakes up in her bed and she's in the kitchen
Cooking,
making breakfast, like eggs and bacon. She's like, once you have breakfast with me, then we can do this, then we can do that.
And he just wants to leave. And he's not even really offering her a BS excuse. And she just starts flinging stuff over and over. And she says to him again and again, "You ain't no nice guy." And Ryan, I have been in this exact situation, and I am not famous.
King is really good about taking one line that somebody says to a character and then having that line echo through the character's inner dialogue for the rest of the book.
And that line echoed through my conscience and some of my worst life choices just for a few days. I am definitely not a singer and I am not famous, but I also feel that at least at points in my life I was no nice guy.
We all have those points.
Yeah.
The thing that was, Larry made the biggest impression on me because before you and I started reading this book, we were talking about it and Salem's Lot and some of the other books, and an observation that we made is that King's characters tend to be very black and white.
Yeah.
They're deep characters.
They have layers, but those layers are you are a white onion or you are a red onion.
Yeah. You're generally a good character or a bad character.
Or you are the personification of child eating fear.
And Larry, he is a good character.
Yeah.
But he treads more into that gray than the typical King character.
He might be the grayest Stephen King character that I've read. I will also get into this when we talk about my second favorite character. But part of the reason I really liked this guy was because I see all this horrible stuff and he keeps getting these chances where you just start screaming at the book, "Okay, here's your chance. You don't have to be the bad guy. You can just make the right choice."
Yeah. They toss him the ball a lot and he misses.
He misses a few times.
Yeah.
I think he finds his stride as we go. He gets better and better. And we'll get into that more as we talk about later chapters. But he is by far my favorite character.
Yeah, and I like to expose myself to a lot of other fans. I listen to some other Stephen King podcasts, and I try to read articles. And he seems to kind of be universally lauded as most people's favorite character.
Yeah.
Which I can definitely understand. I think he's probably the most relatable character for most people. He's also probably the one that's the least archetypal.
Yeah.
At least here in book one.
Yeah, I would say he's probably the least archetypal character that I've read in a Stephen King book, at least so far. I still have 200 pages to go.
Yeah.
But
he could drop the ball right at
he could drop the ball.
All right, so moving on to kind of round out our trio of protagonists here, we have Franny Goldsmith, which was probably my favorite character or one of my two favorite characters from book one.
She was my favorite character for about 10% of the book.
Yeah.
Her introduction, I felt, was so strong.
It really was. So she is of our main characters, she's the one from Maine, because of course it's a Stephen King book and some portion of it has to take place in Maine.
Yeah.
And when we meet her, she's going to tell her boyfriend that she's pregnant, and she kind of even decided before she found out that she was pregnant that she didn't really like this guy anymore, and she was, not that he's a bad guy, but she just didn't have any feelings for him, and she was kind of thinking of breaking it off. So she goes and tells him she's pregnant, and then she doesn't let him do anything for her. Like he kind of gets angry at first, but then he's like, "Well, can I take you to this? Can we do this?" And she just like shuts him down at every opportunity.
I feel it's because this might just be my interpretation. he was giving her the systematic, these are the responses I'm supposed to give.
Yeah, like he asked her to marry her because that's what society
That's what you
expects.
do.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, you don't want that. Do you want to check for the abortion? And
Yeah.
because those are your two choices apparently.
Yeah.
And
marriage or abortion, great.
and again, I love characters like this, characters that see through the BS. Not because they're like a super genius or anything, but they can just read it.
Right.
Unfortunately, without spoiling anything, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. This is the most competent and probably the most endearing we see Franny, and it doesn't. I don't feel she picks up as much after that. That's my take on it.
I think that I liked a lot of her presence in book 2. Book 1. I really liked the descriptions of her relationship with her father and her relationship with her mother and the conflict that exists there.
I like the relationship with the father. We'll get to the mother in a little bit.
I don't like the relationship with the mother, but I think it was well written.
This is the one point where we're probably going to differ.
Okay, we'll get back to that. So let's talk about her dad. Her dad, of the incidental characters in book 1, Fran's dad is probably my favorite.
He is probably also my favorite of the incidental characters.
So she has a good relationship with her dad. She has a not so good relationship with her mom.
She is a white woman.
Yeah, her mom is kind of a the typical king shrew of a wife, heinous bitch, kind of overbearing mother type character.
I can't think of any of their names, but he usually has one of them.
Yeah, like, so Carrie's mom.
Yeah, Carrie's mom.
Or
Eddie's mom.
Eddie's mom, the woman from Misery.
Yeah, she acts just like this person.
Exactly. And, the story is that whenever Fran and her mother come into conflict, the dad never gets in the way. Even though he has a great relationship with his daughter, he never really stands up for her, even when the mom is being unreasonable. And how we meet him is she goes to him, she tells him that she's pregnant. He offers no judgment on her, which she's a college student with no job, and he's just like, okay, Franny, we'll deal with it. Which is amazing in its own right.
Like, what else are you gonna do?
Yeah, and then, well, I mean, like, I guess like some people would disown their kid or tell them to get married or tell them to get an abortion or whatever. But then the next scene is, her telling her mom, and for the first, her mom starts to go off, and the dad finally steps in and defends her, and that's just kind of the oh yeah moment where it's like, but okay, go ahead with what do you think of the mom?
And this is just to my personal taste, I felt the mom, for this novel in particular, was written very soap opera-y. She was very over the top. I'm not saying that reactions like hers don't exist. I have seen them. But I am saying, when I was sitting there reading it, it didn't feel as real as like the heartfelt conversation that she had with her dad, or even the way she saw through her boyfriend's dumb answers.
Yeah.
I saw her as a over-the-top shrew, because she was written to be an over-the-top shrew. And it took me out. It just took me out of it for a minute.
That's fair. Yeah. I mean, so kind of piling onto that, you don't really get anything from the mom except that scene, and then kind of Fran gives a little narrative background on her mom and her relationship with her mom, and then she dies.
Yeah.
So there's no chance to really build that character.
Yeah.
Not that in these 1,000 pages, Stephen King can flesh out every single character.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with that. That's my one takeaway from the mom.
But, on the other side, some of these other, overbearing mother characters that we get in his other books are extremely fleshed out. Obviously, Carrie's mom.
Yeah, she's the antagonist.
Yeah, she's the antagonist. You get so much on her.
Yeah.
And even Eddie's mom in it, I mean, you don't get a lot, but you get a lot more.
I feel like with Eddie, you also get stuff from him as an adult and who he chooses to marry.
Yeah, his wife Myra.
And he's always making comparisons in his head, so you get more of a feel for it.
Yeah, exactly.
A feel for the dynamic. I got that scene to establish the dynamic, but that was it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fair. So then I think talking about Fran is a good way to segue into your second favorite character, Mr. Harold Lauder. So first, please tell us how Fran and Harold kind of come together, and then tell me a little bit about Harold.
Okay. Harold is as Stephen King loves to remind us, a overweight and greasy, smelly wannabe writer.
Mm-hmm.
He is every fedora-tipping edgelord high school student that you can think of.
He's the incel pre-internet.
Yeah. Harold was the brother to Franny's best friend.
Amy?
To Franny's?
Amy.
Yeah, Amy's her name? Okay,
yeah,
I couldn't remember her name.
I think.
Yeah. And
he's the only other survivor.
He's the only survivor from their hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's dead. He drives up in a car he just took off the lot because, like, who's going to stop him? He
steals a car.
Yeah, he's strutting around with this I can do whatever I want now attitude. It's a very much a put on, and Franny sees it as a put on. You can read it, you know it's a put on, and we'll get more into that in a second.
Not to mention when he comes to her house,
yeah,
and says, "Hey, Fran, I'm also alive."
Yeah,
she's burying her father.
Yeah, she there is a bloated corpse in the upstairs bedroom that she has to carry down.
She is digging a grave in her garden, and he wheels up in this like muscle car, and is just like, "Hey, baby, I'm alive too.
I'm gonna go get myself a pair of cowboy boots." I'm pretty sure that's something he literally does.
I was convinced that he was gonna try to rape her in that first scene.
I didn't think that in the first scene. I thought that in a scene that we'll go talk about much, much later.
So they kind of go from there to, she rebuffs him and he leaves. And then she kind of feels bad about it and she realizes that he's literally the only other person that's alive. I can't afford to have a bad relationship. I need to go see this guy. She goes to his house and he's naked except for a tiny pair of shorts, mowing the lawn, crying.
Yeah, bawling his eyes out. Because sometimes grief hits you at different times, and like realizations will hit you in the strangest ways, and you'll just want to. When a good friend of mine died, I started running, and I think Ryan knows this.
Running and running.
Yeah, I'm asthmatic, but I just picked a direction and I bolted, and I kept going until I literally couldn't breathe and was just laying on the sidewalk, and then I finally cried.
Yeah.
That was something that I've really related to. And when Franny sees this, she also kind of goes, "Oh yeah, he's a high school student who just lost his mom."
Yeah. And you learn about Harold that he didn't have a good relationship with his dad. His dad was kind of a blue-collar football man's man. He was not happy with his son. His son didn't play sports. A big revelation that Harold admits is that his dad asked him, "Are you a fairy?" Like
I believe he used the Q word.
Yeah.
he was,
and I didn't.
he was very explicit.
Yeah.
And that is also something that I not with my father. My father is very loving and supporting, but I have been asked that question very directly because of some of my interests. And those were sort of like the little seeds that got me going, oh, maybe I can be Team Harold.
Yeah.
I do find it suspicious that my favorite characters are the asshole and the incel.
Yep.
But we'll get more into that as we go.
Yep. So the story kind of progresses, and they kind of meet on terms where they can understand each other, and they decide that we're gonna leave and we're gonna venture out into the world, and that's kind of where the progression that all of these characters take, where they find themselves in a situation, it's bad, and instead of staying in the town they're in, they eventually start moving out. Larry's in New York. He decides to leave New York. When Stu escapes from the army hospital, which is in Vermont, he decides to leave, of course. Fran and Harold leave Maine. But before we get too into that, we have really one more character, at least from our good side of things, that it was probably my other favorite character from book one, which is Nick Andros.
Yeah, Nick is a good boy, and I will hear no ill will against him.
Yes, this is the Nick Andros Fanboy Association. If you have anything bad to say, we will show you the door. But he is a deaf, mute, 22-year-old vagrant. We meet him. He's being beat up by some drunk jocks.
Drunk, redneck, ill-educated jocks.
And then he gets picked up by the local sheriff, who understands who through talking to Nick, Nick writes down his answers and he can read lips.
Mm-hmm.
Within an hour of talking to Nick, this sheriff is like, well, crap, I understand your story, and one of those guys who beat you up is my brother-in-law, and I have to go arrest my brother-in-law, and I'm not getting laid tonight. So that kind of progresses to, without getting into all the details, Nick becomes kind of a deputy of the sheriff. At the same time, Nick rolls into town. Captain Trips also does. People start getting sick. People start dying. Eventually the sheriff dies. Nick kind of takes over as sheriff, where he has several prisoners, which are the guys who beat him up, that he's caring for. He's also caring for the sheriff's wife, who's also dying of Captain Trips. And he just kind of rolls in as this vagrant, assumes responsibility for the whole town within a couple days, and then eventually just kind of sees the whole town die.
Yeah.
And it's heavy.
He gets a cool eye patch out of it.
He does get a cool eye patch because he gets stabbed in the eye.
If he could talk, he could do a solid Snake impression.
Nick is kind of going back to that theme of good and evil. Nick is probably the most if Stu is lawful good, then Nick is probably, I kind of want to say chaotic good, because he's a truly good, but he's not lived into society, and he doesn't abide by society's rules.
He is the man on the outside who's always been looking in.
Yeah.
He doesn't stop him from trying to do the right thing but he also has done everything he's needed to survive.
And he's also a totally innocent character.
Yeah. He is a soft boy, and I love him.
He is a soft boy, yeah. And then getting into our hard boys, tell us about Lloyd.
Lloyd Henry. Oh crap! Which one was he?
So we meet Lloyd where he's going on a crime spree.
Oh, okay. Now I remember now.
Okay.
He's the dude who has the perfect casting from the miniseries.
Yeah. The guy from Night Flyer plays him.
He has gone on it. He and his buddy go on a crime spree after doing what was supposed to be a setup.
Yeah.
They go and rob this guy because this guy's like, hey, just come rob me, and then I'll tell my bosses that I was robbed, and then we can split all the loot. And after they have him all tied up, Poker, which was his Lloyd's buddy, says, hey, we should pokerize this guy. And as much as I've said Ryan and I'm reminded of us as different characters, I pictured us doing this the whole time.
We had a tendency to do stupid things in college. We never tied anybody up and poked their eyes out, but...
Yeah. I'm going to duct tape his nose just so he suffocates, and we'll just take all the loot and all the drugs.
Yep.
And they take a crap ton of drugs, and they get a crap ton of guns, and when their car breaks down that they stole, they shoot a family and just take that car, and they just keep going. Eventually, his buddy Poker gets shot when they try to rob a store to get more shit, because apparently they just didn't have enough. And Lloyd gets arrested. This guy, he cracks me up. I work in a mental health hospital, and I have a million patients like this dude, and it tickles me pink to see him, a character that just so staunchly reminds me of the path I chose in life.
So, Lloyd is in prison as Captain Trips kind of takes over the country and most other people die, and he actually gets trapped in his cell and can't get food to the point where he actually kills and eats a rat.
Yeah.
Which is, ugh. That's all kind of vomit right there. But the thing that impressed me about Lloyd is he's kind of Larry's opposite, where he is a bad character, but you can tell from his inner dialogue he's not completely bad.
Yeah.
He knows what he recognizes what he's doing is bad and he shouldn't be doing it, and he wishes he could do better, but he's kind of let himself go to this dark side.
He's the character that goes, well, I've already made these mistakes, so this is just what it is now.
Yeah.
He's also, and I'm going to say this as politely as I can for all the children at home, he is really, really stupid.
Yeah.
And I don't mean
but
that...
he is a mental giant compared to his father.
He is a mental giant compared to his father. He is very much, tell me about the rabbits, dumb.
Yeah.
So literally that is a scene in the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the last character we want to highlight before we move on to our next section is our antagonist, Randall Flagg, which we don't get a lot about him in this first section. We meet him when he comes in to free Lloyd from prison, and he asks that Lloyd become his follower. What are your impressions, without getting into other books or just book one of the stand? What's your impression of Randall Flagg?
He is Charles Manson. That is my impression of Randall Flagg. He is a guy who, again, without getting too heavy into future chapters, is a dude who knows exactly what to say to get you to do what he wants you to do. And I think that is very haunting.
And we'll kind of keep it light with Randall Flagg for now, because we're going to be talking about him a lot more in book 2, and I presume in book 3.
Yeah, we'll get to the T-posing.
Yes. So moving on to our next section, what were the scariest moments of book 1 for you?
I have 2.
Okay.
The first was the initial spread description. It starts with the sheriff who came and talked to some people where the first patient 0 came into the town.
Yep.
And it says he was infected, and then he talked to this dude from out of state, and he gave him the virus, and then he traveled over there and gave his waitress a virus, who went on to spread it to 12 other people, who spread it to this family who was on vacation, who finally found out that they could have a good vacation, and when they go to the pediatrician because their kids can't stop coughing, they give it to all the kids there, and it spreads and spreads, and that's just how fast it goes. And reading that while I'm sitting there in hazmat gear scares the crap out of me.
So on the off chance this podcast is a huge success, and somebody is listening to this 10 years from now because they're listening to our backlog, this is being recorded in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of what people are talking about when we're discussing COVID is how it can spread, and how it's important to wear a mask when you go out, don't go out if you don't need to go out, social distance when you do go out, because what people don't realize is, if you're within a couple feet of somebody and you're both unmasked, and even if they don't have the sickness but they're carrying it, they can spread it to you, and then you go to church, and you spread it to 10 other people, and then those people go home and spread it to their families, and they go to school and spread it to more people.
And this is something that you sometimes just don't think about until all of a sudden your girlfriend has it, and then both of her kids and her parents have it. That recently just happened to me. I've been tested 3 times. I'm good. But you sit there and you go, this just so easily reached people because you just don't know.
Right.
You know what I mean? And you're sitting there and you're thinking about it. And again, Stephen King even said this himself. COVID is no Captain Trips. There's a very funny tweet about it.
Yeah, a very funny and very scary tweet.
But at the same time, it is just something that at the time I found super relatable. My second biggest scare, and I don't remember the exact quotes, but there are some dream sequences in this book where people start having these nightmares. Fran's first nightmare after burying her father gave me a literal nightmare where the same thing happened. There's just a body bag or a body under a sheet, and then she's all of a sudden realizing, oh, my dad's not under there. It's the smiling man, and it just starts slowly sitting up, and you know she knows what's under there, but it's not even revealing itself. But because you're in your dream, you just know, and that got me.
So, for me, as a parent, one thing that always gets me is kids.
Mm-hmm.
And, the scariest book I've ever read is Pet Sematary, for all the reasons we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Pet Sematary, I saw as a kid, and I read the book as an adult, and literally every time I'm outside with my kids playing in the yard, every single time I'm thinking about keep them away from the road, keep them away from the road. Few movies or books have ever scarred me in a way that Pet Sematary has, where I cannot be outside with my kids and not think about keeping them away from the road. Especially, I have a son who has an intellectual deficiency, and so he's not aware of the realities of getting hit by a car, so I have to be doubly aware for him.
Yeah.
So the scariest part for me in book 1 was towards the end. There is a vignette where it discusses some of the survivors who ended up dying not because of Captain Trips, but died from other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a few in there about children who survived when their parents didn't. And specifically, there's one about a little kid who falls off their bike and hits their head and ends up dying of the wound.
And there's one that falls in a well.
Yeah, and the one that fell in the well.
If the virus didn't also kill dogs, maybe Lassie could have saved them, but that was not the world King made.
That was the most horrific part of book 1 for me, just because I could see, my family dying off, except for my son.
Yeah, you see your family in there.
Yeah, and what would my son do if he was left alone?
That same chapter had what I consider one of the funniest parts. And that's when this woman who realizes she hates the dude who got her pregnant and her son just keeps the bodies in the freezer, and she goes down to look at them almost to lord over the fact that she's alive, and then gets locked in there.
Gets locked in the freezer, yeah.
That tickled me pink, but I'm a psychopath.
Oh, okay, so brief aside here, and spoilers for Firestarter 2 Rekindled, the miniseries sequel to Firestarter. Spoilers. It's nothing you're going to miss. But, so, towards the end of it, the bad guy gets caught by the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
The bad guy had just murdered one of his underlings, and the FBI is interrogating him, and they say, where's this other guy? We need to talk to him, too.
Mm-hmm.
So the bad guy goes, oh, yeah, I'll show you. Come on. He brings him back into the kitchen, and he opens up the meat locker, and the guy's body is frozen in there, dead, frozen in the meat locker, and the bad guy's like, showing the FBI, he's right there. You can go interrogate him if you want. After you. Thought that was funny.
That was pretty funny.
And then, aside from that scene specifically, just in general, the scariest parts were, just all the comparisons to COVID. And, I mean, I've said this several times throughout this episode, is this book would not have been nearly as scary if we read it 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Something, you hear about the Spanish flu and tuberculosis and all these other things growing up and in school, but a pandemic isn't something you can ever realize until you live it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's not to sound cliche, but obviously it's changed the world, and it even changes the way that we interpret fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Because fiction is a big part of my world.
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine reading this book 2 years ago as compared to reading it now. But yeah, and then before we leave this section, I just want to give a shout out to Bernie Wrightson's illustrations. If you haven't picked up this book yet, I highly recommend getting the uncut version that's illustrated. Bernie Wrightson also did the illustrations for Stephen King's Cycle of the Werewolf and Creepshow.
That is so good.
They are chilling. Or even if you're not picking up the book, just Google them and take a look at the pictures, even if you're not going to read the book.
Speaking of these illustrations, just a small brief aside, I have a lot of friends at work that read, and they're sitting there, they're reading their books, and they ask me what my book's about. I tell them, and they're like, okay, that sounds kind of morbid. I'm like, yeah, but it has pictures. Just flip it open to them, show them a bloated corpse. I have a picture book.
I have a picture book.
A 1,000-page picture book.
Okay, so we've been singing the praise of Stephen King in The Stand all night here, but, Stephen King is human, and humans do error, and we got to kind of highlight some of our least favorite parts about The Stand. And I'll let you kick this off, Daniel. What's your least favorite part? What general criticisms do you have? What would you change if you could?
Alrighty. My least favorite part, and I think I gave this away earlier, was the parlor scene. The only part I really liked about it was when Franny's dad comes in at the end and breaks up the pretty much almost a brawl between Franny and this shrew of a woman. To me, it just felt very soap opera-y. I didn't have enough of a connection to this woman to really get behind it. And come to find out, when I'm looking stuff up about the book, this was one of the scenes that was cut. And I did not know that, and I kind of went, okay, I kind of understand why. It doesn't add too much. It adds a little bit, but it didn't work for me personally. General criticisms. This is something that's very hard to describe without having the book right in front of me, which I unfortunately do not. I do, for my mass market paperbacks that I buy for 10 cents. I think I got this one for a couple bucks. I do highlight parts. There are some areas that I feel are glossed over, and some areas that I feel are very much over-explained, and that's very Stephen King. He either does one or the other, and it's always a curveball. Like, when I want something to be further expounded upon, you just don't get your answer. And when I go, okay, I've had enough of this, he's like, okay, but we have 5 more pages. The biggest example I can think of is they start talking about people that are just naturally immune to the virus, and I was like, oh, that's going to be such an interesting plot point. Except we don't really get any explanation. It just exists because it needs to, or we wouldn't have any characters. We would just have a dead world.
Right.
There is such a thing as natural immunity. It's a rare phenomenon where there are people who are naturally immune to the HIV virus.
Yep. And
scientists don't really understand it. And when I looked up the numbers, it was pretty proportional to what this was.
You didn't have to say that part.
Yeah. But I'm sitting there and I'm like, I kind of really thought that the book was going to be about these people are immune, let's try to figure out why. And it kind of throws me for a curveball, because then it kind of has it's not like an anime time skip. We're not getting the Stan Shippoed in here, but we are getting like, okay, it's been a week.
The Hurricane Chronicles.
Yeah, We got, it's been a week, everyone's dead now.
So, I said this earlier. The hook of the book is the virus, but it's not about the virus. It's about, and this is really more book 2.
That's where my criticism kind of levels off.
Right, and we'll talk more about that in the next episode. But the virus itself is really just the device or the vehicle that gets us to the real theme, which is good versus evil.
Mm-hmm.
Which, and my kind of criticisms of book 1 are similar, whereas one of my favorite parts of book 1 was the lore and the world building, where they're talking about the virus and how it spread and how people dealt with it. And my biggest criticism is I just wanted more of that.
Yeah, I really feel like that could have literally been its own book.
But maybe that's, me 2021 Ryan, who's living in a pandemic, wants to hear more about this when that's not what the book's about.
Please give me an answer so I'm not afraid.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't have like any really harsh condemning criticisms of King in the first part of this book. It's really more preferential. This is what I wanted to see and this is what I didn't get. But at the same time, I can acknowledge that I'm looking at this book from a perspective, living in a pandemic, where that's coloring what I want to get out of this book, whereas maybe 2 years ago I wouldn't have had the same opinion.
That's fair. I can accept that.
Except, and then kind of playing devil's advocate to myself, my favorite part of any apocalyptic story is usually the downfall of society.
Yeah.
And just hearing how we go from a structured society to chaos, and not just zombies, but I Am Legend and Jack London's The Scarlet Plague. I love that's what I like about apocalyptic stories. How did we get from 10 to 0? How did we get there? And you get a lot of it in book 1, but I felt like there should have been more.
I also feel, I don't know, maybe there didn't need to be more, but by God, I wanted more of it.
I would agree that there probably didn't need to be more.
Yeah, it is a thick boy.
Yeah, it's hard to read a 1,000-page book and then come out of it and say, "Oh, there should have been more."
Yeah, this should have been a series.
I wouldn't want to take out anything. There's a lot of development of Stu, Larry, Franny, and Nick, and I don't want to detract from any of those because they're all important characters moving forward, and you have to have a good understanding of them.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But I think that reflects well in the book that this is kind of our one criticism. We both share it, and it's not really a serious thing. It's more preferential.
Yeah.
Okay, so Stephen King is known for horning it up and being a bit of a horn dog.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about sex in The Stand.
I will tell you specifically, Ryan, a little bit about what I think about sex in The Stand. And I will say the tent scene, and and I will say I was gonna fuck her.
Rewinding briefly, the whole tunnel scene is also one of the scariest parts of book 1.
Yeah, that was also bad.
Also terrifying. This is the scene with the tent, where basically, Larry's with this woman that he escaped New York with. She's not adjusting well. She was a blue blood, and she's not getting along well in the post-apocalyptic world. And she ends up killing herself by taking a bunch of drugs in the middle of the night, and she vomits. She suffocates on her own vomit.
Yeah, this putrid, green, mildewy looking stuff.
Yeah, they're sleeping in the tent together. Larry leaves the tent to go enjoy the view, not realizing she's dead. Then he goes back inside to have sex with her, and that's when she realizes he's alive. And 1, it's disgusting. 2, it's scary. And 3, this was also kind of a big character moment for me, for Larry, is he just leaves her. He just leaves he leaves the tent, the sleeping bags, and her, and just says, "Fuck this, I'm out."
I would have done the exact same thing.
I think that my moral side, my Steve Rogers side, says no. You should have buried this woman. But I think I might have done the same thing.
Yeah, no. Superman is my favorite character. I believe in good boys.
Mm-hmm.
I would have left.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I'm not a nice guy.
I mean, I don't think if you don't bury her, you're not a nice guy. But that's a lot for anybody to process.
I think leaning on the not a nice guy was the fact that his first reaction to seeing her dead was, I was gonna fuck her.
Yeah, that too. Not oh my god, she's dead. It's I was gonna have sex with that.
The second thing I would like to say about sex in this book is Harold so very clearly wants to have it with Franny, and he's not getting it.
Nope.
And this is what I found strange about this particular Stephen King book, is that everybody who wants to get laid is all of a sudden being cock-blocked by nature and preference.
Yep.
And that was kind of funny to me.
And to be honest, there's not a lot of sex in book 1, but there's a lot in book 2.
There's a lot of
So we're gonna have a lot more to talk about in this segment next episode. And then moving on to Religion and the Stand. This is known as being one of Stephen King's most religious books, and he's not like he's a spiritual person, but he's an author that's always had the rep of not liking organized religion.
He has had at least from the criticisms I've heard, of not liking fundamental Christianity at all.
Right, but is a spiritual person.
Yeah.
So, how do you take your understanding of Stephen King and his spirituality, and how do you see The Stand as an interpretation of that, at least in book 1?
This book confuses me. I'll tell you why. I have a lot of friends that are theologians. Like, they actually went to school to study religion, and I've had lots of discussions with them. And this book shows this. It will become way more apparent in book 2. I super swear. This book shows a very profound understanding of Christian theology that I was not expecting from Stephen King. It doesn't come across as a condemnation. It doesn't come across as a, hey, this is a great way to live. It comes across as this is just the way things are. And if you talk to like serious theologians, like people who like study the history and the philosophy, your bishops, your historians, that's the kind of answer you're gonna get. Is it's this is just the way it is. And it's very strange to read Stephen King build a world where he goes, yeah, this is it.
And like, we were talking about with sex, we're going to have a lot more to talk about in book 2. After we meet Mother Abigail and we find out more about Randall Flagg. This is going to be probably a huge part of our discussion in the next episode. So we'll table that for now. And then as we start to wind down here, something that I love that Stephen King does is he tends to tie his books together with shared characters, shared locations, references of other books and current books, and kind of just talking about things in The Stand that relate to his other works. The big one is Randall Flagg, which, without getting into spoilers, he is the antagonist of both The Gunslinger, which is the first novel in the Dark Tower series. He's also the antagonist of The Eyes of the Dragon, which is a novel from the 80s. It's a fantasy novel Stephen King wrote for his daughter Naomi. It's never been adapted on TV or film, so it's one of his lesser known books. But Randall Flagg, or the Man in Black, is the antagonist of that. And then also this was something I picked up on while I was reading and then looked more into online, and a lot of people feel the same way, that Randall Flagg might be he who walks among the rows from Children of the Corn.
The first thing that really makes you go, is this the case, is I believe it's Stu Ridman's first dream, where he dreams about the eyes and the cornstalk, just these burning red eyes watching him.
Right.
Yeah.
And then just another quick fun one. There was a quick reference to the Tommyknockers in this book, which is funny because the Tommyknockers wouldn't be published for more than 10 years after this book was published. But the main character, Bobby, being a character who lives in Maine and writes westerns, is directly referenced in this book.
Huh.
But, and then, kind of starting to wind down here, is there anything else that was notable? What are some of your final thoughts, or was there anything that you particularly thought that was funny that you wanted to mention? And if not, just what's kind of your final thoughts closing thoughts on book one?
My closing thoughts on book one is, while I wouldn't call it my favorite Stephen King novel, it is definitely classic King.
Mm-hmm.
I feel if you read a lot of Stephen King, he kind of comes in these segmented eras, and I would probably go, there's a pre-car wreck Stephen King and there's post-car wreck Stephen King.
Yep.
This is definitely pre-car wreck Stephen King. This is him at his most raw. He is writing down the visceral things that he wants to write down, creating the world that he wants to create, and he's not considering anything else that might be going on, that might be considered insensitive. He's just writing it because this is the way the book needs to be written for him.
Right. As opposed to some of his more recent works, which are penned with they're more socially conscious.
Yeah.
And then another, if we're looking at the history of Stephen King and where he's at in his life as he's writing, one of his huge struggles is with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 70s specifically was alcohol and then cocaine, and then he also had an addiction to painkillers in the 80s.
Cocaine is a hell of a drug.
Yes, and this was pre, I believe this was pre-heavy cocaine using, but he was definitely drinking heavily while writing this book.
You must suffer for your art, and his was addiction.
Yes, his was definitely addiction. So for me, just looking at book one as a whole, I liked it a lot.
Yeah.
I would say I was a little underwhelmed with it, but that's partially because the hype. This book is lauded by a lot of people as his best book, and some, it's usually in the top 5s and the top 10s whenever you're looking up lists of Stephen King novels. I think that, like I said at the beginning of this year, I kind of started with Salem's Lot and then have just kind of been running through all of his classic novels. And It was the first one I read, and that one's my favorite. Just looking at book one, which of course is an incomplete story, I don't think that it compares so much to It or Salem's Lot, Pet Sematary, The Shining, which are kind of, I think, some of his best writing. But I liked it a lot. It's classic 70s King. Like you said, visceral was a word that you used that I like a lot. And spoiler alert, I think book 2 ups the ante.
Book 2 definitely gives you more of that classic King feel.
And I'm a lot more engaged in book 2.
Yeah. I burned through book 2 a lot quicker than I did book 1. So I honestly can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah. And that'll be it for our first episode of The Horror of Babylon. We are going to be releasing episode 2, which will cover book 2 of The Stand, and just kind of giving you a real brief outline of what we're going to be looking to do for the next so many episodes. We're going to cover book 2, of course, and then book 3. We'll also be covering the miniseries from the 1990s. We're going to cover the new miniseries, and we might also cover the comic book as well. And then we also have some more plans post The Stand. We will be talking about some more Stephen King literature. We're going to do some non-Stephen King books as well. We'll hold off on announcing those until we get closer to that. But we are going to go deep on The Stand, covering it, all the adaptations. So
this is where you come for the deep lore.
Yes.
Well, that was horrendous. I would tell you boys good job, but the dryness of my sarcasm would likely evaporate all the moisture in both your bodies. Anyway, if you want to hear more of this, please subscribe to their YouTube channel by searching for The Horror of Babylon. You can follow them on Twitter at HorrorPod69. The Facebook page is under The Horror of Babylon. And on Instagram, these fools are The Horror of Babylon, one word. Reach their assuredly empty inbox at thehorrorofbabylonpodcast@gmail.com. You can also request their Discord server link via any other channel. And finally, if you are foolish enough to support this abomination financially, search for The Horror of Babylon on patreon.com. And God save your soul if you do.